Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. If you like this podcast, please tell a friend, give it a mention on your favorite social media platforms, and go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It might just inspire Apple to promote us a little. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSpod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I'm off to a conference in New York this week. I've got about 24 meetings scheduled with members of my trade association and prospective members of same. It's an annual event that used to center on the Waldorf Astoria, but since that's being renovated into a Chinese spy tower, it's sort of diffused among a bunch of the nearby hotels on the east side of Midtown Manhattan. It all culminates in a black tie dinner on Thursday featuring a guest speaker who does a spiel and then a Q&A. This is in front of like a bazillion people. Last year was Will Smith, who's used to being seen by tons and tons of people. My first time I went to this, it was Tony Blair. This time it is Dale Earnhardt Jr. Not sure what insights he's going to have into pharmaceutical manufacturing ingredients, but I'm not paying a speaking fee, so whatever. But all this means it's the start of trade show season for me, so expect the occasional off-schedule episode and or updates from the road. Now, speaking of the road, this week's guest comes from about as far away on the road as possible, namely Melbourne, Australia. He's Bram Presser, author of the fantastic debut novel The Book of Dirt from Text Publishing. Bram was visiting New York this month to collect his Best Debut Fiction Prize at the National Jewish Book Awards, and it's one that's well-deserved. The Book of Dirt is a hybrid memoir novel about Bram's Czech grandparents' experiences surviving the Holocaust. I don't want to give away too much by going into any details about this exactly. When I say hybrid, it's about Bram's research and sort of fictionalizing the stories themselves of his grandparents and their parents and, well, all the history that goes into it. I should note, those sections are distinct, segging from his explorations and research into the imaginative sections. It all fits together beautifully, and his storytelling shows major chops, both in the overall sense of carrying the reader along this horrifying journey, as well as in the kind of discrete moments of tension and drama in his characters' lives. The genesis of the book was Bram's discovery of an article after his grandfather's death detailing the man's experiences as a sort of curator under the Nazis for a planned Museum of the Extinct Race. That is, the Germans were collecting tons of Jewish texts and other objects as they were dragging Jews out of their homes and into the camps, and apparently wanted to have an exhibition ready once they were gone to show some pieces of the extinct race to which I belong. Now, as Bram starts researching this, when he makes this discovery about his grandfather, he learns that the article's not exactly true, but that the truth is even stranger. And then he starts learning more about his grandmother and her family, uncovering these stories of survival and tragedy that are just heartrending, but also unique. It all brings him up against some hard facts about the lives and deaths of Jews in the camps, but also butts up against the unknowability of our lives, and not just the lives of people who were taken to Theresienstadt and Auschwitz-Birkenau, but even those of us in our day-to-day worlds. Anyway, the Book of Dirt is so much more than I've related here. There is a very Czech angle to it, a very Czech Jewish mystical angle to it, which any of you who have background in that are going to get. It is amazingly well written, a beautiful story. And again, that hybrid nature of Bram's researches and where they're taking him, and then the stories themselves as he fictionalizes them is just beautifully done. But the book, it's all about survival and fate and the role of myth and storytelling and the tenacity of hope, which I know sounds like a cliche, but I enjoyed the book immensely, and I hope you give it a read. Now, caveats. There was some weird radio wave in the background a few times. I heard it when we were testing at the very beginning, like a Bluetooth or Wi-Fi signal that was reverberating. All of us turned off our phones, laptops, etc. No idea where it was coming from. Plus, we were at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, so there's a standard car and truck noise outside. Now, here's Bram's bio. Scruffy Scrivener, semi-reformed punk rocker, recovering academic, occasional criminal lawyer, two-time cartoon character. After schlepping around the world for 10 years in the acclaimed punk band Yidcore, Bram Presser realized he was getting too old to sleep on concrete floors and smear hummus over himself every night. Swapping the rubber chicken for a fountain pen, he has since dedicated himself to writing. In 2011, Bram won the Age Short Story Award, and since then his stories have appeared in Best Australian Stories, award-winning Australian Writing, The Sleeper's Almanac, and Higher Arc. His debut novel, The Book of Dirt, was published in Australia in 2017 by Text Publishing to wide acclaim, and went on to win the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award for Fiction, Best New Writer and People's Choice Awards in 2018, as well as the prestigious Voss Literary Prize. The novel was published in the U.S. in 2018 and recently won the Goldberg Prize for Debut Fiction at the National Jewish Book Awards. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Bram Presser. I'm torn because I actually have two different wacky opening questions, but I'll ask the banal one instead and just go with how the book evolved for you. Actually, we'll start with the slightly wacky question. What it's like talking about the book 2 years after it's come out, it's finished. I know it's just in the U.S. for about 6 months now, but continuing to revisit it with schlubs like me?
It's really strange, actually, because you go through the whole first kind of wave of press when the book comes out, and like it was an 8-year process writing it, and it was actually published almost 8 years to the day from when I started it. And I was really like excited, and you're on this like crazy adrenaline high, and you don't expect that the book will have a life beyond 3-4 months. That's the natural life of a book for people to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And then good things kept happening with it, and I found that it kept growing, and then it finally kind of settled down in Australia.
Yeah. And
then suddenly my publisher said, okay, we're going to release it in America now. Go there. And this was actually in October. And I went, I was just like, okay, I can sort of bring myself to get back into it. And then I went through the whole process again, and I did an okay. I got back to Australia, and I said to a writer friend of mine, I said, I think I finally exercised it. I'm done, right? I'm ready to start the new book. And I think that, for as long as I felt that there was any unresolved aspect of Book of Dirt, I've resolved it now. Mm-hmm. And I sit down to start working on the new book. And then I get a call that I've won this, National Jewish Book Award. And here I am again. And it's like, and it's funny. I actually came in here going, I can't imagine talking about it again. yet I find myself still incredibly excited by it. Just because, I don't know, like every time I talk about the book and I talk about my grandparents, I feel that I'm spending more time with them. So, you know, if for me it was a way of getting to know them and getting to actually, understand them and have a much more kind of, I suppose, real, knowledge of them. And getting to hang out with them as the people that they were, as opposed to the people that I thought they were. I'm kind of all right with that. Yeah, it is weird though. It's weird, like that I'm still talking about the same book 18 months later, but you know, it's much better than the alternative.
It puts me in mind of Hollywood people who have to do publicity for a movie they finished like 2 years earlier and act as though it's oh yes, no, I just finished it last week or just saw it. But really,
I've stepped straight off set.
But that's why they're actors and we're, you know.
Yeah, we're not. Yeah.
Right? Besides the looks thing, I guess, too. But not just you. I'm pretty schlubby myself here. But was there, I guess, a sort of learning curve beyond the book itself in terms of, when you mentioned revisiting them in the process of, and I know this is a meta question about interviewing and all that, but were you learning more about them in the process of talking about them?
Well, this is interesting. Like I really, after the book was published and after it was getting a bit of attention, I started getting emails from people who knew bits of stories and other things. And there were also a couple of unresolved issues I had in the book, one of which is, why was my grandfather, because he had to have been, complicit in that article, becoming the dominant narrative of his experience? Mm-hmm. Because although I only discovered it 2 years after he died, it had actually originally come out in 1987 in Yiddish. So he was alive and knew very well that it had come out and never said that it wasn't true, even though, like, it's abundantly clear that it wasn't, right? So I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And the other thing that I really was bugging me was who was Mr. B, who is this character in the book it's not even in the book. This is in real life. In these letters that my grandmother was sending back to her mother in Prague from the concentration camp, she kept referring to this Mr. B. And I spent a lot of time trying to work out who it was while writing it. Didn't get anywhere, and ended up, because 2/3 of the book is a fictionalized retelling of what I sort of discovered of their stories. I made a character that became Mr. B. That said, literally about 2 weeks before the book went to print, I said to my editor, actually, I want to include the stamp from Theresienstadt that my grandparents had kept, and it was in my parents' safety deposit box in the city in Melbourne. And I went to get it and I take it out and I remembered it because I'd seen it as a kid. I remembered it just being a stamp, but it actually turns out it's on an entire envelope. And on the front, the envelope is addressed to a Max Bloch. And on the back, it's sent from an Arthur Schöpkes. And so given that Mr. B, as far as we knew from the stories, was a neighbor, Schöpkes was the name of the neighbors who lived next door. So it occurred to me that it could be one of those. As a matter of fact, it's likely that it was one of those two people. And so I was kind of like, I said to my editor, I think there's like a novella in this. And she said, step away from the envelope. You're not, scan the stamp and walk away. Mm-hmm. But yeah, like, it is something that I do. Like, I think I've resolved both of those questions since, but I don't know. Look, because I'll never really, really know, I have to be kind of content in what I have discovered and what I have created from what I've discovered. But I think it's something that I will always kind of sit picking at the little scab of my memory in the background.
Yeah, were you much of a, we'll say, detective as opposed to researcher prior to this?
No, look, I was, I grew up on detective novels, if that helps. So I was that's
part of it.
That was my training. I studied hard on Agatha Christie, Patricia Cornwell, you name it. But
not Dorothy Sayers, because she was an anti-Semite. I'm sorry, go on.
Really?
That's what I've always heard. Oh. But
actually, it's funny. I never read. I did read Georgette Heyer though. Anyway, leaving that aside, I also I went to law school. I was in my area of law is criminal law, and so that sort of kind of, fact finding was very much a kind of a part of my training as well. And also, like, I spent a few years doing time as an academic, and that also is very, the research side and learning how to find information that you're looking for. Admittedly, when I actually came to try to find my grandparents' story, I think because I was so close to it, I pretty much threw everything that I knew in terms of good practice in research out the window. Also, to be fair, I look the way I look, which made it very difficult for me to approach, respectable and respected institutions asking for information.
Especially if they Google your name. Yeah.
Well, they did. Well, I mean, the funniest thing for me was when I went to Beit Terezin in Israel to ask about aspects of the article. I turned up, I knew how they would react if I just turned up. So I sent all of my early inquiry emails from my university email account. So it was the University of Melbourne, top Australian university. Yeah. So I sounded respectable, knowing exactly how I would.
What they were going to.
Yeah. And I turned up there, and no matter how much bona fides I had established in the lead up, I walked through the door. The woman just looked at me, looked me up and down, and she was just like, "So you're the researcher?" And I'm like, "Yeah." She goes, "Ah," and literally turned around and walked away.
I would tell a story about back in the 90s. I used to serve subpoenas to people, and had a shaved head and looked relatively.
Did you wear suspenders and like big boots and
stuff?
No,
but scrawny, menacing in its way.
It's even scarier if you've seen like Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, But people would invite me into their homes if I was looking for like a neighbor to serve, and they, "Oh, come on inside, we'll tell you." And I was like, "You understand this is how serial killers work?" But whatever, that's cool. So yeah, I can imagine that would be a detriment, just the appearance when you're trying to.
And I have to say, this now is like how I am now is pretty conservative compared to how I was.
Yeah.
Particularly in the early visits, because that was like I was at the kind of the height of my punk rock life, and I mean my first foray into research was actually on our last tour of Israel, and I said to the guys, "Look, we're here. This is where Yad Vashem and Beit Terezin are. So you guys go home, and I'm just going to stay on for a couple of weeks and do a bit of research." But like I was at that point, had a spiked pink mohawk, and I've got 2 piercings in my face now, but I had like 12 then, and I'm a reasonably tattooed guy, and I'm not what a kind of 72-year-old survivor archivist wants walking into there.
Yeah. Plus the metal detectors. That's always an issue. So I was going to ask what was the toughest part of research, but it sounds like just, getting people to let you in the door is...
I mean, in a practical sense, there was that. The other thing that was really difficult was because the story, as I eventually uncovered it, was so unknown, people just assumed it wasn't true and couldn't be true. So people didn't actually bother beyond any sort of initial dismissal. They would just say, well, that story is not true. Yeah. It can't be true. No possible version of it can be true. I don't want to burst your bubble because it's your grandfather and you love him, but this is essentially a lie, right? And that was for the first, I would say, 2 years of research, time after time, the response I got. And that's actually what caused me to start delving into fiction as well, because I got to a point very early on where I thought, I'm just not going to get the story. And because I now have this obsessive need to know my grandparents, but my grandfather particularly at the beginning, the only way I'm going to do this is through fiction. And I mean, I read almost exclusively fiction when I'm not doing stuff for work. And so it's the way I understand the world the best as well. And so I started writing them as characters based on little anecdotes I knew from their time in preoccupied Prague. And I should say Prague before the preoccupied part. Yeah. They were occupied with other things,
Preoccupied.
Prague before the occupation. Yeah. And so I was writing these, and I actually found I was really enjoying it because I knew enough of the story at that point to have a kind of narrative arc, but I had the freedom to imagine what, like, my grandfather's a perfect example. You know, he was born in a little village in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, in what's now the Ukraine. He was the son of the rabbi and came from a rabbinical dynasty. And he was the chosen one to be the next rabbi, but he decided that he would run away and pursue a secular education. So, yeah, this is all part of the kind of family tales that have been told over the years. And so for me, it was really interesting, what life would be like for someone who had greater aspirations in this tiny village.
Yeah.
So, I was able to write that. And then I'm like, now imagine turning up in Prague where, it's the big city and you're a little country boy who dreams of something big and you're overwhelmed by what you're seeing, what you're experiencing. And so I kind of put him through his first few days in Prague. And I was really enjoying that. And I knew, actually, I wasn't writing about my grandmother at that point. But after I had failed to get any information on that Israel trip, on the way home, I actually went via Prague. It just happened that I had a ticket back through Europe. And I have family still in Prague. My great grandmother was a convert. And after the war, she reverted to, well, I would say no religion rather than Christianity. Yeah. And so she stayed in Prague until she died in 1989. And her two youngest daughters also stayed in Prague, until they died. So I have quite a lot of family. I'm friendly with them, and particularly with my mum's cousin Ludwig, who is the son of my grandmother's youngest sister. And he's like the funniest guy in the world. I love him.
Makes her a fun character.
If I can go somewhat on a tangent, my favorite thing about him, he every year goes on these adventure holidays. He decides he'll go somewhere completely remote and live as a mountain man for whatever. So he calls me one day. Well, when I say calls me, I think he must have emailed me and he gets his daughter to translate because he speaks pretty much no English. And he said, "Do you think it'd be possible for me to build a raft, a wooden raft, and paddle across from Melbourne to Tasmania?" And I said, "Well, if you want to die within about 27 minutes, sure." But and he goes, "Oh, it's not possible." I'm like, "No." He goes, "Okay, I'm going to come anyway." So he turns up. He goes to Tasmania by plane, thankfully, and he just disappears for 2 weeks. And he comes after 2 weeks. We get a call. "I've had this great time wandering through the forests of Tasmania. It was amazing." He comes back to Melbourne completely disheveled and looks like something from Deliverance. Anyway, so he's this mad guy, right? And so I met with him in Prague, and this actually happens in the book. And we're just sitting at a cafe, and he says to me, "Look, I know you're looking for your grandfather's story, and sorry you're not getting anywhere, but I don't know if this interests you." And then he pulls out this envelope, and in it are these, very fragile, flimsy pieces of paper. And they're, and he flattens it out on the table, and he's like, "These are letters your grandmother sent from concentration camp to Babička, to my great grandmother, her mother, in Prague." And I didn't realize at that point, I mean, I knew, but it had never really, the penny had never dropped, that she was, having not been born Jewish, the Nazis didn't consider her Jewish. So she was never taken to concentration camp. Meanwhile, my
great-grandmother.
My great-grandmother. Yeah. Meanwhile, my great-grandfather and the two eldest daughters, the oldest being my grandmother and the next one, Irene, were taken. And my great-grandmother and the two youngest daughters stayed in Prague. And I had no idea. They stayed in touch the entire time. And it wasn't just people in concentration camps were able to send small postcards with, a maximum of 30 words. But these were full letters. So these were smuggled out. And they had, the contents in them was, it talked about food that needed to be brought in and medicines that needed to be brought in and this person doing that and that. It was clearly, if that was intercepted, they were screwed, right? So suddenly I had this glimpse into this entire other story that was there. So I had set off to write my grandfather's story, but suddenly I realized my grandmother has a story that's very well worth looking into, because there was some sort of smuggling thing going on, and there was stuff. And also I knew I had to include my grandmother anyway, because part of my grandfather's story was that he met my grandmother in a concentration camp. I didn't know at the time which one. Mm-hmm. And so that was like the part of the family mythos. So I started putting these mostly together as fiction. But I also had the letters, so I wanted to actually show the letters, so I wanted them in the book, right? And so I scanned them and what have you.
Were you a big Sebald fan?
Well, it's interestingly, I'm something of a Sebald fan. I'm a massive Dasha Drindich fan.
True. Yeah.
And she actually ended up being my mentor. She died last year, and that was, I was like bereft for months. She, to me, was the most extraordinary observer of and writer about the Holocaust. She wasn't Jewish, Croatian writer. Her novel Trieste literally changed my life. And this was the interesting thing. I struggled for a long time to work out how to tell this story, particularly because I had the quest dimension, the factual, for want of a better term, that based on documents, photos, records, etc. Plus this kind of burgeoning fictional reimagination, which was I'm very obviously influenced by like fable and mythology and magical realism and all that. So I loved both of them, and I couldn't work out what to make of it. And I read Trieste, which is Dasha's masterpiece, and I was just like, this is how you tell that story. And I always remember sending it to her when I finished the book, and I was like, this is really, I feel like I don't want you to think that I've just like ripped you off, essentially. Right?
Yeah.
But like, you know what you mean to me. And she goes, okay, fine, I'll read it, sort of thing. And I thought, and we used to converse like, a few times a week. We became quite close. I cannot tell you how nervous I was for those 2 weeks it took her to read it.
Yeah. And
this is the best. She sends me a list of questions about it. I'm like literally tearing it to shreds. Right. And I'd send back defenses, and she'd go, but this and but that. And she was the most fiercely intelligent person I've ever met in my life. And at the end I said, okay, fine. I don't want your endorsement. I'm sorry I ever gave it to you. And she says to me, oh, no. Oh, okay. I was just testing you. I just wanted to see how far I could push you. I like the book. It's great. Of course I'm giving you the endorsement. I just wanted to see how you'd react to my questions. I'm like, thanks a lot. You pretty much gave me a nervous breakdown, but that to me was how I kind of came about writing it, because I quite by chance picked up Trieste from a shelf in Hatchards in London, just because the spine in its incredibly beige simplicity appealed to me. Mm. I started reading it in the store, and I was hooked, and I literally bought the book and read it over the next day, just sitting in cafes. But that opened up, even though I had read Sebald before, like Dasha, it almost seems like blasphemy saying this, but I think Dasha did it better.
Yeah.
Right. And and it made me understand the the possibilities or the potential of documentary fiction.
In terms of the value that sort of authenticity provides.
And also that you are able to, to root it in like heavy fact, like documentary fact, that has a narrative value in itself.
Right.
But that you can also depart from it in interesting and imaginative ways. And actually, I have my other mentor is an Australian author called Arnold Zabel, who's like this amazing, I call him the great Australian fabulist. And I said to him at one point, I said, I'm struggling with this fact fiction divide. And I don't want to be, I don't want readers to feel that I'm in some way, misleading them. He said, all you have to do is just make it clear when you're writing fiction and when you're writing, what you purport to be
the memoirish.
Yeah, the memoir
sections.
stuff.
Yeah.
And he goes, you're allowed to blur it, right? But don't do something that you know is absolutely a work of your imagination and suggest that it's true. You know what I mean? And I think that's what I kind of tried to do. And that's also why I ended up having a bit of in Australia, it's very rare to write on a title of a book underneath the title, a novel. I know that's like a thing that happens in America a lot from what I gather. But,
that's one of Clive James's things. When he put out the Unreliable Memoirs, he said, you Americans have this fixation on memoirs having to be factual.
Right.
He said that's really nowhere else do we consider it to be,
That's yeah. So and with this, I really insisted with my publishers that it have a novel on it. And they're like, but we don't do that in Australia. I'm like, but I need it for my.
We'll say mental health as good
Yeah.
as that is, but
well, just because I don't want people to think that I'm trying to pass off fabrication, and particularly I think when you're writing about the Holocaust, I think that's particularly important to keep in mind.
Because you bring up the factuality fiction schism, Holocaust traps. Besides the being afraid of misrepresenting the Holocaust story as true, were there Holocaust cliches that you were like, gee, I do not want to write that story?
Yeah, well, it's so okay. So I actually said about halfway through writing it, I said to my editor, if at any stage you think I'm writing just another Holocaust book, just
that's what I'm wondering. How do you
shake my hand and walk away? Do you know
how
what
do
I
you
mean?
avoid that?
And I think that it's and it really is a problem, and it's becoming a greater problem as we move towards this kind of post-survivor world, because I think we've come to simplify, for want of a better word, Holocaust narratives into particular templates.
Right.
And I was very aware that I did not want to in any way fit into a template. I wanted to tell. I happen to be fortunate that my grandparents' stories individually were outside any of the templates anyway. Right. So I was able to, and like even writing about life in the camps. This for me, this was one of the big areas for me. Life in the we growing up, like I grew up in Melbourne, which has a very strong Holocaust survivor population, and the kind of the shadow of the Holocaust looms large.
I'm going to ask about that afterwards, because I knew nothing about that and why that concentration exists there of all places. I'm interested in, but we'll get to that after.
So I just wanted with life in the camps to be. So we're fed this template of, basically machines of death, right? Factories of death, where people went in, they had no agency, they were, worked to death or murdered in whether, in gas chambers, crematoria, shot in, you name it, in the back of trucks or whatever. But what you don't really ever get a sense of, or a genuine sense of, is life in the camps, right? And it took me to see Son of Saul to realize that, like, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a magnificent film. And, it's about a guy in the Sonderkommando who work in the gas chambers and the crematoria in Auschwitz, in Birkenau, and leads up to the uprising. And there are scenes in the movie where it goes back to the barracks, and that's when I suddenly realized these were they were these like mini metropolises. They were micro societies. Like, people were living meaningful lives in a horrific context, right? They were trying, because they weren't there for like 5 minutes. They were there for months, sometimes for years. That's not to say there weren't plenty who were just literally on arrival killed, but those that weren't actually had to like etch out lives.
There's still a social dynamic.
Yes, and this is and like also in Theresienstadt and all that, and there's all these really complex kind of societal dynamics that played out in the camps, and I really wanted to and also to give agency back to the people in the camps, because I think agency tends to be taken away. I think there is that sense of that it was a prescribed life. And to a certain extent it was, right? But like at the same time, there still was agency and there was dignity. And these are important things to bring back, and not in some sort of like romanticized way. That's the problem. The ones that try to do that often end up being like these, you know,
we call it a Hallmark card, but
yes, well, that's exactly.
Of,
it's saccharine sweet, you know, and that actually really upsets me, those sort of books, because I just find them so inauthentic, and I find that they minimize and sanitize the Holocaust experience. That doesn't mean you can't write about relationships within the camps. I don't mean necessarily romantic ones, just interpersonal relationships in the camps, in a way that's very real and that represented how those societies worked. So yeah,
it's a challenge, but again, being cognizant of those traps.
So
how much that informed.
So I mean, I had like my grandfather's story in Terezin was so strange and different that I was able to write his story quite free of any of the existing narrative templates, and also even his Birkenau experience. Like, very few people have heard of the Czech family camp.
I thought it was great that you'd be the only guy in history who broke into Auschwitz, as opposed to guys who everybody trying to escape. So.
I mean, that for me was that was one of the strangest moments of my life. I turn up at Auschwitz. I'd traveled there with Ludwig, my cousin. He kind of went off and did his own thing, and I wanted to find this Czech family camp. And the Czech family camp, for those who don't know, was like most people, or a lot of people know that the Nazis were using Theresienstadt as the show camp, so that if any allies, Red Cross or whoever wanted to see what they were doing to their Jews, they would take them to Theresienstadt and go, look, they're, yes, sure, we've got them confined, but they've got it all right. Like, I mean, this is not the most comfortable living by any stretch of the imagination, but like, we're not wholesalely slaughtering them, right? And but they also had a plan B, because they had a concern that the Red Cross might come, see Theresienstadt, be like, yep, this is all fine, but we've also heard rumours about these camps in the east. We want to see one of those. So they had in Birkenau one of the sub camps. Like, if you go through the main entrance of Birkenau, on the left are the two kind of main camps, the men's and the women's, and on the right there are like 6 sub camps. And the second one was the Czech family camp. And there, they brought Jews from Terezin. It wasn't actually only Jews, but people from Terezin. And they didn't shave their head. They didn't. They weren't in striped pajamas. Mm. They were filthy, and they were it was squalid and what have you. But in terms of everything you think about when you think about Auschwitz, it wasn't that. And so they were always, and the other thing, the sinister side, I mean, there are many sinister sides, but one of the sinister sides is that they liquidated it every 6 months so that they would bring in fresh people so they would look healthy at any time, right? And so and that's where my grandfather was for his short stay in Birkenau. And so I wanted to write about it, so I had to visit it. And when I turn up to Birkenau, I said to the guide, I'm like, look, this tour's fascinating and all, but really I just want to see the family camp. And he said, well, it's not open to the public. But if you like, I think really this is actually when looking like I do was a benefit, because I think he thought, oh, he's a rebellious guy. I like this, So he goes, if you go all the way down the road and chuck a left and you get to the second set of gates, you'll see that it's the chain isn't really well fitted. You could probably squeeze through. And so that's exactly what I did. I broke into what was the Czech family camp. And it was actually it was the only time in my entire search that I broke down and cried. Because just the immensity of it, like, you're standing in this huge space, right? And all the barracks are burnt down. They were wooden barracks, but all the chimneys are still standing. And you know that on either side were sort of regular subcamps. Actually, on one side was the quarantine, but on the other side was, a regular subcamp. So, and up the back was actually the train where the trains arrived. So you knew that they would be able to see what was going on. People, and that also astounded me. This idea that the Nazis would have the arrogance to bring the Red Cross to that, thinking that they would not look at anything that was happening just off, off camera, so to speak. So like all of these things were outside the stories told when people tend to write about the Holocaust. And and also even my grandmother and her mother, the smuggling, the fact that my great grandmother came and visited my grandmother in Theresienstadt is like astounding. And I got pulled up by my editor. She said to me, "This can't be true."
The Christmas visit?
Yeah, the Christmas visit.
Yeah.
And she said, "That can't be true." And I said, "Well, I'm told it is." And it was told by my great grandmother to Ludwig, because he was very close to my great grandmother. And he spent a lot of time with her, when she was dying, and she told him a lot of stuff. And my editor said, unless you can find documentary evidence of someone visiting Theresienstadt from outside and being able to get there, you can't put this in the book. And I scoured records, and I ended up finding a couple of cases one of which was a guy who wanted to go and see his former housekeeper who was being kept in Theresienstadt, and he literally just walked through the front gates.
Yeah.
He went to the commandant's office, knocked on the door.
Because who would possibly be coming in? The same thing as breaking into Auschwitz.
Yeah. Knocked on the door of the commandant's office and asked, I won't say demanded, but somewhere between asked and demanded, to
I'd like to see my...
Yes, I would like... yes, I would like to be taken to this woman. And the commandant called guards and had him escorted out. But he did get that far, right? My great-grandmother only went as far as they met at the gate, at the fence, right? But enough to give them Christmas gifts and also slip my grandmother the ring that she kept with her throughout the entire Holocaust experience as a potential bargaining tool if her life ever came down to it. Just extraordinary.
Now, you mentioned visiting Prague as a kid. Did you ever have trepidation visiting Germany, visiting Poland, places like that?
No, like I'm... It's funny, like I always remember, like my grandparents were always like, you can't have German cars. We don't want to, and like I know, like my family's not Polish.
I should frame this: Mom, 1940 in London; Dad, 38 in Bucharest.
Oh, right.
So we've got history and Ukraine, Polish on my mom's side, etc. We don't have survivors. We'll put it that way.
Okay, wow. Yeah.
There was a great deal of.
Yeah. So and in Melbourne, particularly where there's and most of the survivors are Polish. Like there is you don't visit Germany, you don't visit Poland, For me, firstly visiting the now Czech Republic, but Czechoslovakia back in the time was fine for two reasons. A, because I was visiting my great grandmother.
Yeah, that's what I figured. So you've got a waiver on that one.
But also because the non-Jewish Czech population was well known to be one of the best. Yeah.
And that's why I wasn't singling out Czechoslovakia as opposed to
the Poles.
Yeah.
Right? Are you allowed to say that? Isn't there a law against that now?
Well, you can't download this episode there.
But I think for me, so I went to an ex-girlfriend of mine was studying in Berlin, so I just went to visit her, right? And I just found it fascinating. It's an amazing place. And I don't know, I'm a sucker for experiencing places where history happened. Yeah. So
have you done Nuremberg?
No. My parents actually went there last year and they said it was unbelievable.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I had a business trip to Frankfurt and the double whammy of really not wanting to be in Germany, plus Frankfurt being the most boring city I've ever traveled to. Coworker said, you should go to Nuremberg. Went there, and especially in the old city, you do the museum while you're there, and you see the rally grounds.
Apparently, the rally grounds are just extraordinary.
Yeah, it's amazing. The other interesting thing is Nuremberg itself, the old town. Hitler commissioned this wonderful model of the whole town, etc. In one of the few remaining buildings, they have that model plus what it looked like in 1946.
Oh, wow.
Because apparently the Allies really took it out on Nuremberg. They rebuilt everything using that model as their example.
Really?
But the old town,
very cool.
they pretty much left Durer's house, one castle, and that was pretty much it. Everything else was just brick. So
you reap what you sow, I suppose. Yeah. But no, and the other thing with Germany that I found, Germany's the one perpetrator country that has really dealt with their past.
And that was part of
that's really interesting for
why
me.
I was okay going there.
And so I was like, I felt that
they've been trying to deal with it.
Yes, a country that has accepted responsibility and has tried to build on it and has actually really kind of become a beacon of human rights in that sense, right? As opposed to certain other countries which have really struggled to
pretended it never happened.
Exactly. Yeah. So I remember when we I didn't have much interest in staying in Poland for any great amount of time, partly because my family's not Polish, right? So I really was only interested in visiting
for
Birkenau
research purposes.
And I wanted, irrespective of research purposes, I mean, that's what finally got me there. Yeah. But like, I wanted to see where my grandparents had been, right? And, but I remember, and I talk about this in the book, that I remember turning up there with Ludwig. I remember speaking to him actually on the drive, and he said, "Oh, I've booked us this hotel. It's just outside Auschwitz." I'm like, "Do you mean Krakow?" And he goes, "No, it's just outside Auschwitz." And I was like,
"Jolly Hotel Auschwitz or something?"
Yeah, and I'm like, "Are you sure?" Like this coming, and like we're following the GPS, and we turn up, and this hotel literally looks out over the wall and barbed wire of Auschwitz, like and there's like between the hotel and Auschwitz is like a pizza shop. I'm like, well, this is weird. And it was a very, very strange, surreal feeling. But like, for the purposes of the book, it turned out fantastic.
Yeah.
But as an experience, it was so weird. But like, I always remember though, when I crossed the border from Czech lands to Polish lands, and just what I'd been fed about Poland growing up, because I grew up in a Polish survivor community, where everything about Poland is dark and scary and sinister. And I remember just crossing the border and just going, well, there's not really that much of a difference, is there?
Lord of the Rings, thing that suddenly gets dark.
The Tower of Sauron, or whatever it's called. Sauron. Yeah, but anyway, it was just, look, as you got further into Poland, particularly in the rural areas, it was clearly still a lot more rooted in that kind of, wooden barnhouse villagey kind of vibe that Czechoslovakia had grown beyond. I mean, look, to be fair, Czechoslovakia replaced it with ugly brutalist buildings during the communist era. But since then, there's a lot of very nice building going on, and plus it's also got the beautiful Gothic architecture that's still there now, housing McDonald's and stuff like that. But which is it's the weirdest thing. That's actually for me, having gone there as a kid when it was still communist, and so my great grandmother died in '89. I think the last time I saw her would have been in about '87. I would have been about 11 then, and it would have been about my fourth time. And I very clearly remember communist Prague. And it's so strange to go there now, where it's just like, British stag parties and exactly. It's touristy, it's Kafka Inc. It's they've sort of ruined it in a way. And it's, exactly. Seeing McDonald's in a place that I remember as this grand old kind of council building or something like that. It's just so strange.
That's capital.
It is.
Toughest part to write? A
few.
We talk about the challenges, but toughest.
There are certain scenes that were particularly difficult. Most of them had to do with my grandmother. Mm-hmm. I think she had a far more horrific, in the physical sense, experience through the Holocaust. I mean, she was an extraordinary woman. But like, there's her arrival at Auschwitz. That scene was very difficult to write when she swallows the ring and that was really hard. When one of I think the greatest stories of her survival was that in Auschwitz, in Birkenau, one of the letters was intercepted. And when you talk about kind of miracles of survival,
don't give that scene away because it's an amazing moment. But yeah, something happens. It gets her off the hook. Basically,
it gets her off the hook, but she's still like beaten senseless afterwards.
Just on general principle.
Yes. Well, I mean, look, the alternative had what happened not happened, she would have been killed. So like she got away all right, and knowing, and she was actually quite open that she actually tried to commit suicide afterwards after the beating because it was so severe that she just wanted the pain to end. Right. So the idea that I had brought my grandparents back to life to make them suffer again was really difficult. And thinking about that, and thinking about the kind of, I don't know, there's like a moral or ethical responsibility as a writer, and as a grandson, to be, not to make these people you love suffer, but at the same time, you're trying to give an honest and, in as much as you can imagine it, accurate account. There were also, like, there were some things that I had to really give a lot of thought about and maybe omit, actually. Like the one classic issue for me was if my grandmother never gave the ring away, and it's known that she was, a very good-looking young woman, and she was the fancy of a number of the soldiers and what have you. Like, was, to what length did she actually go to survive? And I was never going to explicitly say that she crossed that line because I'm not going to say it without having absolute evidence of it. But I can't rule it out either. So I just leave it as a kind of a maybe. And that was difficult. Like thinking about the way I was exposing my family was very difficult. It's interesting. I got a call from my mum's cousin who lives in Australia, Irene's son, right? Probably shouldn't have outed which particular family member it was, but nonetheless. And he said to me, look, I'm just reading your book and I really like it. It's really good, but tell me something. Why do you have to say that your great-grandfather, his grandfather, was a drunken gambler and such a terrible, pathetic man? And I said, well, because he was. That's just the reality. And, he ruined the family and how she managed to stay with him and rise above it is, to me, incredible. And I said to him, I said, look, and the other thing is that if I didn't get across quite how bad he was, you wouldn't realize quite how amazing she was.
Yeah. I was going to say, because she makes choices that
is, and I've often said this, that I set out to write a book about my grandfather, and I think I wrote a book about my great-grandmother. She, to me, is the hero of the story. I knew her, like, as I said, I was 13 when she died. She visited Australia once. I visited her probably about 4 times. And I just knew her as this tiny, crumpled woman. I was like, 6, 7, 8, and she was in her 80s, so you can imagine what she looked like to me. She was, the 700-year-old witch sort of thing. Yeah. The good witch. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right, exactly. And like, you can't imagine someone who you knew that old when you were that young, as a young person, doing normal, well, firstly, living a normal life as a young person, but secondly, doing the incredible things I found out she did, right? So, like, that for me was actually probably the most extraordinary part of the book. Like, despite finding incredible things out about my grandparents and these really strange bits of history that they were witness to or part of, just discovering my great-grandmother as a person and as this, like, amazing woman, was probably the best part of writing it for me.
Were there things you were afraid to find out? Oh, you mentioned the potential that your grandmother had to survive. Yes.
Another one was just that the story was not true. The one about my grandfather, there was actually no basis in truth. That he had basically made up a story that he told this journalist. And at the beginning, I actually thought that was probably the case until records did start appearing, purely by chance.
It still gives you a story. It gives you a story about how people invent myths about themselves. But
it's
to
a
have
story
some
that
grain of truth to it is more interesting.
I would have had a very difficult time, because then you go into the kind of area of feeding Holocaust denial, and like, I don't know whether ethically I could have written that book.
Yeah.
And it would have actually really, I think I would have had a crisis of conscience or faith or something like that. I don't mean religious faith, but
Yeah, I was going to say,
not in a religious sense,
between our various tattoos, I don't think we hold up too well as Jews.
But I really would have struggled with that and knowing what to do. I probably would have just had to leave it alone. Maybe I would have. I don't know. Maybe I would have written a different book. But that was a great concern for me. And it's interesting because I think Mum shared that concern, because when I first said to her that I was going to go out and try to, having read this article, I was going to go and see whether there was any truth to it. And she said to me, "Look, if you're going to try and find his story, are you prepared to find things you don't want to know? Like things that actually don't show him in the best, in good light."
And that's what I wonder.
Yeah. And I said to her, I think I have to. I need to know the story. And if you need to know the story, you have to accept that you might find out things you don't want to find out. She said, "Okay, in that case, go for it. You have my not that I needed her blessing, but you have
Jewish mother. That's always important for us.
Yeah, exactly. That's right." And she used to she was very hands off about it, Mum, which was kind of interesting because it was her parents, and she was going to finally find out the truth about her parents. But she was very careful not to push me about it, and just waited until I would every now and then go, "Oh, I found this amazing thing," or "This happened," and when she finally read the book, she was kind of like, "Whoa, okay, whoa," and I said, "Yeah." Like thinking back to your initial warning, it's funny that what I actually found out turned out to be incredible, right? Yeah. But thank God for that, right? Because I don't know what I would have done if it had not been.
Was she one of your sources, or at least someone you try to corroborate stuff with? Or
her parents told her nothing.
Gotcha.
Nothing. They told us nothing except for that one time at my brother's bar mitzvah where my grandfather, who was given a 7-minute speech allotment, spoke for close to 50 minutes, and everyone just kind of was switched off and wasn't interested. And he had tried to kind of open up about the Holocaust for the first time, and everyone just kind of was like, "Yeah, can we please get on to main course?" And it kind of scared him back into his box. But yeah, so I actually didn't really have any sources early on. I ended up, and I couldn't work out a way to fit this into the Quest narrative, but my greatest source is someone who is mentioned as a character in the book, in the fictional part, as one of the students. So I got an email about 5 or 6 years into the search from this guy in England, in Suffolk, a guy called Frank Bright. And he emailed saying, "Look, I'm 93 years old. For the last 30 years since my retirement, I've been trying to track down the fates of all of the people in my class photo from 1942. And he sent me the class photo. And he said, "I've managed to track down everyone. Most people were killed. The only person whose trail went cold was the teacher, whose name was Jakob Brand. And I have heard around the traps that there's some crazy guy looking for someone with a name that's very similar to that.
Yeah. And
I'm wondering if that's your grandfather." And I looked at the photo, and that face did not change one bit from 1942 to 1996 when he died. And it's just like, I'm like looking at my grandfather as what do you be, about roughly 30-year-old guy, just looking up at me. And I was like, no way. And we started this correspondence. It fills folders, my correspondence with Frank. I ended up going to Suffolk to visit him. I spent a day with him. Incredible guy. incredible guy. He's like, the BBC have done like specials on him, and he's very big in the. Weirdly, his main thing is he works in his local area, like the war. When I say the war memorials, I don't mean like as in museums, but like the air raid shelters, the various the hangars and all that. So he works on maintaining them, right? And he does a lot of talks to schools and what have you. Incredible guy, and he was able to tell me a lot about life in Prague during the occupation, life in my grandfather's classroom. And it just turned out that his parents had, once the Nazis shut down the Jewish school, so initially they stopped, they forbade Jewish kids from going to regular schools. They put them into this school in Yakimova Street in the old city.
Thank you for providing a Czech pronunciation guide at the end of the book. It would have been better at the beginning of the book, but still, it was good to have.
And a cast of characters at the beginning. So they eventually closed that down at the end of the 1942 school year. And this guy, Frank's parents organised for my grandfather to give him private tuition. So we actually had a personal relationship with him over and above a general school classroom relationship. So he was able to give me actually quite a lot about my grandfather and his life, and then just also the general life of Jesus. So I was able to kind of fill in a lot of gaps and also fit my grandfather into...
To have a background for him to...
Yes, exactly. A kind of a context of Jewish life in occupied Prague. So he ended up being kind of my main source. And then there was the Jewish Museum of Prague, who were they were very helpful. I always feel bad about this. I would go there regularly. I would turn up. They were incredibly generous with their time and what have you. I think they thought I was nuts and was on a wild goose chase, but they no matter how inane my questions, and I can assure you they became incredibly inane and incredibly repetitive and whatever, but they were always with great grace answering them and earnestly. And I ended up having sort of a relationship with them such that when his name appeared so they just happened to be scanning their archives as I was doing this, and his name started appearing. And they're like, the weirdest thing has happened. Like, I know you're searching. It just so happens that you are doing it at exactly the right time, because his name is appearing in all these records, on timesheets, on ration cards, to do with his secret project, right? Which turned out to be this Talmud Commando that he was part of.
Which could have been the name of your punk band, but... Well,
in retrospect, I sort of...
Yidcore is good, but come on.
Yeah, Talmud Commando would have been... Well, we would have had to be a bit more religiously bent.
Yeah, true.
But, so they became the main... Between Frank and the Jewish Museum, that's where I got most of my stuff about my grandfather. And then Ludwig, from what my great-grandmother, his grandmother had told him in the latter years... And also I think his mother and aunt were a lot more open with, I mean, they hadn't gone to camps, but they had heard the stories from their sisters and what have you. So they told him more stuff. So he told me a lot. Plus I had the letters. Plus a lot of people don't have like boxes and boxes of family photos. If you had Jewish ancestry on both sides, your whole family shipped out, your house was cleaned out and all that, and all those photos were gone, right? I am lucky that I have I've got photos of my grandmother as a kid, I've got them, all that stuff. So I had kind of a bit more of a kind of a resource kit to draw on.
What does this process teach you about the unknownness of everyday life? Of not necessarily life in the camps, but, if somebody was trying to reconstruct...
No, so this is the one thing that I think I really took from writing the book was that we really don't know much about the people we love.
Yeah.
Like, we just accept that we have this idea of who they are, and of... Like, even I think about this with my parents. I'm very close with my parents. I'm a very good Jewish boy. And, I know... generally the trajectory of their lives. I know bits and, obviously for the parts that I've been around, I know bits. But if you had to ask me to sit down now and write a biography, let's say, I really don't know the particulars of their lives that well.
This is also a male-female thing. Men, in general, and you may break the curve on this, men tend not to know how their parents met.
I know how my parents met.
Okay, yeah. Women tend to know the story of their parents. I don't know how my parents met. I know they're working for El Al in the 60s in Israel.
Awesome.
That's it.
Yeah, what happens on El Al stays on El Al. That's right. But so it's interesting you should say that though, because there was the family story that my parents met in concentration camp, and the actual story that was told was that my grandparents met in Auschwitz when my grandmother was the student of my grandfather, because he was 14 years older than her. Now, that was the story that we had always clung to. As soon as I looked at the train records for both of my grandparents, it was clear that was not true, because they were not in Auschwitz at the same time. The only camp they were in at the same time was Theresienstadt. So assuming they met in Theresienstadt, I then had to work out how they would have met in Theresienstadt. And I had one more piece of the puzzle, which was that my grandmother told me, I spent a lot of time with her as she was dying. She had cancer, and I spent a lot of time by her hospital bed. I actually just once asked her, I said, why did you pick Grandpa? Like, of all the people you could have picked. I mean, he was a great guy. I mean, I would have picked him, but why did you pick him? And she said to me, I saw the way he treated his mother. And I thought anyone who treats their mother like that, that's a good person, right? And I didn't know at the time that she had another love who, after the war, who dumped her, and then my grandfather's persistence paid off, right? But what actually really caused her to give him a chance was the fact that she remembered him fondly for the way he treated his mother. So then I knew that she knew his mother. So it occurred to me that the way they must have met would have been if my grandmother and my grandfather's mother were in the same barracks. Right. And when he visited his mother, he would have seen her and met her. And so that I was able to create an entire kind of narrative story thread for through that. But it's funny that if I had asked my mum how her parents met, she would have said, "Oh, Nana was Grandpa's student in Auschwitz." Yeah.
Because again, we have these family myths, and myth making also plays a role, well, a double or triple role throughout the course of the book. Conflating different Jewish myths with, what survival in the camps was like. We'll put it this way. Your background with that sort of mythology, and
I was
were you raised on
I was very much raised on it. My grandfather was a wonderful storyteller, of the old tradition. Yeah. And I grew up on stories of, well, particularly the Golem, obviously, because I always find it funny. All Czech Jews have this kind of exceptionalist attitude that sets them apart from the other European Jews who went through the Holocaust, whether it be that they were treated particularly better by their fellow country people, or whether it be that they have, they're a bit more sophisticated, or that they have an entire mythology that is particular to them, that basically at the exclusion of the other Jews,
the chosen.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And I think, given that my grandfather was raised firstly in a Hasidic household, and in a rural, really out in the country village household, where I think all of the mythology and the storytelling was really, that was just part of the atmosphere of his world. And he continued to, he told stories in that way. And he was a big reader. He was very into a lot of the kind of Czech writing of the 20s and 30s, which he kind of passed on to me. Kafka being the obvious one, he gave me his copy he left me his copy of the book. So I think that and I actually still love reading fables. I love reading mythologically based stories, and particularly ones that have really, that are steeped in a long storytelling tradition. So I just think it was natural that when I came to tell the story, especially because I had this one question that there was a burning question very early on in the process, which was, why did nobody talk about, well, whether initially it was why did nobody talk about the Museum of the Extinct Race? But then when I got further, why did nobody talk about the Talmud Commando? You know, of the people who survived, who were part of the Talmud Commando, of which there were maybe 6 or 7, they never spoke to one another. None of them gave testimony. There's no record, you know, like survivor record of the Talmud Commando. And so it was bugging me, and I thought maybe they found something that was really important, but something that ultimately came to nothing, right? And so there was some sort of guilt, or there was some sort of, and then I thought, what could they find that would be a book? And then that the actual concept of the Book of Dirt came to me really, really early. This idea that there would be a Siddur. This is not really spoiling too much. That you know, when they opened the Siddur,
something special.
Yeah, right. And it was related to, you know, mythology and what have you. And I loved that idea. And I had the title The Book of Dirt from almost the beginning. Yeah. And I knew the book was going to be called The Book of Dirt. And there was, you know, when you sit down with your publishers, always at some point you discuss possible other titles. And we went through 4 or 5 or 6, and then we were all just like, no, it's clearly The Book of Dirt. Right? And actually, you know, I had a very funny thing happen where just before it went to print, it was announced that Philip Pullman would be releasing The Book of Dust at roughly the same time. Yeah. And we all went into like just absolute panic. And the lead designer from my publisher said, we all went to him and go, what are we going to call the book? And his name's Chong. He said, it's staying the Book of Dirt. This book is the Book of Dirt. It doesn't matter what it is. Yeah. You know, it's the Book of Dirt. And I always kind of joke going, the best thing about sticking with the Book of Dirt is that I'm sure some of the success in sales was from people who thought they were buying the Book of Dust. Yeah. But, you know, so that kind of worked for me as well. But,
and it starts off with a fable sort of thing. Yeah,
exactly,
so, you know, they might get lured right in. And,
that's right. They're almost companion pieces.
Yeah. Now, do you think we talked early on about the close reading and your career choices. Do you think close reading informed the career path, or did the career path build up your skill as a close reader? What do you feel was?
No, I think I've always been a reader first.
Yeah, but I mean, close reader in terms of like trying to get underneath whatever's in the text.
Yeah, no, I think that was just like I've always been obsessed with writing. Firstly, as a craft, but storytelling as a craft as well. So I did. I think I've. There's
you were reading to break down the stories and figure out how to.
I was doing both. I thankfully haven't lost the ability to just enjoy reading a book. Right. Yeah. I actually have some writer friends who said it actually pains them that they can't just enjoy books anymore. I always say I am and always will be a reader first, right, and just like a fan first, right. But that said, there are some books that I read closely because there's something in it, craft-wise, whether it be in the craft of writing or of telling a story, that I want to understand, and for my own professional development. That's what we call it, as a lawyer.
Right.
So
I'm going to get credits for this.
Yeah, that's right. That said, I think I was always going to end up doing law because it's the pursuit of language lovers. You really are just learning. You're honing your skills in how to excavate whatever can possibly be excavated from a sentence. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, trust me. My day job, I'm a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry, but for a weird part of it. So I can sleep at night. Right. But helping with legislative language.
Right.
It's one of the...
And it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. If anything, part of it is my old symbolic logic training also, where you're trying to make sure whatever conditions you were setting up, there's brackets on the other end that finish this part out. But yeah, having no legal background whatsoever, I'm pretty good at faking it so far.
Here's the thing. I think if you kind of get language as a construction, as a logic, I think you can probably, wing it in a lot of different areas.
Yeah.
Quite well. And this is the other thing about the Book of Dirt as well for me, is ultimately actually about, I always say, to me, it's actually not even a Holocaust novel. To me, it is a book about how we tell stories.
Yeah.
And how we come to tell stories and how we come to understand stories and how we come to, it's about identity, memory, how we can know ourselves and the people we love. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, that was very much part of for me. And I think, I wanted to write a book that was also about, that could be read deeply on the level of how do we tell a story?
What's the next story?
I have.
I know you keep getting these awards and getting dragged away from.
Yeah, well, it's kind of strange. I have it's a short fable when I want it to be kind of, 120 odd pages, which is also weirdly about memory and identity. I always say if the Book of Dirt is about how much can we know the people that we love, this next book the fable is about how much we can possibly know ourselves. And then I also have another longer work, which is, going to be another few years in the making, which is similar in style to the Book of Dirt in terms of it being an investigation into the lives of people, real people, and an event that happened to them. But it's not the Holocaust. It's something that happened in Australia that has not been spoken about, and about which when it comes out, when on the odd occasion that someone does speak about it, it comes out as a completely different version every time. And so I love that.
Looking forward to it. Last question. I could have gone into literary influences, but I'll pass on that one because we're going to get together again next time you're back in the States for something like this. Your Jewish punk rock experience.
Yes.
Basically, it's a sort of how does that inform what you do? But in terms of the songwriting translate into prose, performative aspects being both. Temporal versus something that's permanent like text.
Well, that is actually, I found that one of the strangest things because I come from, a music background and a punk background at that. And so writing was always the part that I liked. So the crafting of songs I loved. Mm-hmm. But the thing with writing music, where it kind of, I think the great advantage of writing music is you get an immediate response. You know very early on whether what you have made is good or bad. And, you might spend a few hours writing a song, or even it might last over a few days or a couple of weeks to write a song. But you can then take it out to an audience, play it, and they'll either be like, yeah, that was great, or nah, right? Whereas the leap of faith that is taken in writing an extended piece of prose, particularly when it takes you 8 years, I can't begin to tell you, above all, what a relief it is how well this book has been received. Like, aside from anything else,
worth the investment in time.
Can you imagine spending 8 years on a book that got universally, slammed by critics, that no one bought, and that was forgotten about 4 weeks after it was released?
And this is why I never took up writing. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
But you got to take. There was every chance it could have gone either way.
I know.
And that's the thing. But also, I think.
But that ephemeralness of performance.
Well, I actually think it's.
I don't mean ephemeral,
ways,
but
I actually think that in some ways it is the grandest of performance, because you are putting yourself out there in such a, I joke that I used to stand on stage half naked, smeared in hummus, screaming into a rubber chicken, but I feel far more exposed with this book than I ever did in music.
That's a persona.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I wish I could say it wasn't really me.
We'll pretend it's a persona. It's okay. Now, I guess that also adds to the question: did your public readings for the Book of Dirt involve any hummus or anything?
I might have been in a genteel. Yeah, but this is the funniest part. When I had the launch, I had people who
were
fans. Yeah, it's always weird saying that, but saying, so just out of curiosity, if we come to this launch, do we have to dress in clothes that are going to get splattered with hummus that we don't care about? I'm like, no, don't worry. You're safe. The most hummus you might see is on the snack table on the side, where you can, in a genteel way, take some pitta, dip it in, and eat it like a normal person.
Awesome, Bram. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's been amazing.
And that was Bram Presser. His amazing debut novel is The Book of Dirt from Text Publishing, available in the US, UK, and Australia. Check out Bram's site, brampresser.com, for more of his writing, music, events, and other stuff. And that's BRAMPRESSER.com. He's also on Twitter as Bram Presser, all one word, and apparently he's on Facebook. After we wrapped, I asked Bram, so, who you been reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that, and get a little extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The fourth quarter 2018 episode features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Eddie Campbell, Nora Krug, Jason Lutz, Summer Pierre, David Small, Mark Derry, Michael Gerber, Angela Himsell, Kathy B. Graham, Shahar Pinsker, and Bill Cardelopoulos. And the first quarter 2019 version is going to be coming out in a couple of weeks. They can support the Virtual Memories show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode at the AKA Central Park Hotel, so that was the usual George Washington Bridge toll of like $12, $30 at the parking garage, and $6 for the subway. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Michael Hacker, Michael Janisic, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Craig P. Steffen, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Nathan Englander, author of the new novel Kaddish.com. He's also the author of a number of past works, including For the Relief of Unbearable Urges, What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank, The Ministry of Special Cases, and Dinner at the Center of the Earth. I actually got all four of them off the top of my head. Now you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It'll all go to helping build us a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.